This is CTV News with Scott Roberts.
Good evening. Mi Jung is off tonight. We begin with a heartbreaking discovery, almost too horrific to comprehend. The remains of 215 children, some as young as 3 years old, have been found buried near Canada's largest former residential school in Kamloops. Today, emotional reaction is pouring in from Indigenous leaders and residential school survivors. And a warning, the details are disturbing and maybe triggering for some viewers. CTV's Allison Hurst reports from Kamloops.
The investigation is still in its infancy as the community is still learning more details about the disturbing discovery. But the idea that remains were here has long been spoken of, but not documented. Buried near the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, a heartbreaking discovery. The remains of 215 children.
It was devastating. It was actually quite mind-boggling. And you know, it brought some of us to tears.
Some as young as 3 years old.
What was heard was, and what they were told was that when children were missing, that they were told they ran away.
I felt for all of the students that I went to school with, and then I felt for all of the parents who missed their children and they never came home. All of those little ones who were buried with no dignity at all.
The remains were found by the Kamloops Wet'suwet'en Band using ground-penetrating radar.
We want this to come to resolve. We want people to know that this history is real. The loss of the children is real.
The residential school was Canada's largest and closed in 1978.
The beatings that people used to get.
Jeanette Jules went there.
You hear clunk, 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 clunk up the stairs. And it's one of the security guards. And then you start hearing whimpers. And the whimpers are because here's the guy that molests people.
This discovery, reopening old wounds of the horrifying treatment of Indigenous children.
Our little ones were put on cattle trucks and brought to the school and deloused and separated from their own family. And, you know, it's heartbreaking.
And brings even more questions.
If it happened here, you know, has it happened at the other Indian residential schools? Because this was, you know, something that, you know, a mass grave like that was never marked, never known, and all of a sudden, you know, in May of 2021, it's been discovered.
At the memorial, signs and flowers are left as everyone navigates the painful path forward. These are the preliminary results. The band is still waiting for its official report. The coroner service is assisting in the investigation. Allison Hurst, CTV News, Kamloops.
We're also hearing tonight from political leaders and from the Catholic Church, which was responsible for running the school for decades. Nafisa Karim is following this in the Breaking News Center. Nafisa.
Scott, let's start with the Prime Minister tweeting today that the news breaks his heart, calling it, quote, a painful reminder of that dark and shameful chapter of our country's history. I am thinking about everyone affected by this distressing news. We are here for you. There was a moment of silence in the House of Commons today as well. Premier John Horgan tweeting, each child has been forever taken from a family and a community that loved them. This is a stark example of the violence the Canadian residential school system inflicted upon Indigenous peoples and how the consequences of these atrocities continue to this day. We also heard today from Public Safety Minister Mike Farnworth.
And I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the Kamloops and Secwepemc people who are dealing with the continuing tragedy and impact of the residential school system.
Today, the Archbishop of Vancouver saying in a statement that he's filled with deep sadness at the discovery and, quote, the pain that such news causes reminds us of our ongoing need to bring to light every tragic situation that occurred in residential schools run by the Church. The passage of time does not erase the suffering that touches the Indigenous communities affected, and we pledge to do whatever we can to heal that suffering. And the Catholic Church ran the school for 79 years. Scott?
Nafisa. Thanks, Nafisa. 215 pairs of shoes now line the steps of the Vancouver Art Gallery to honor the children whose remains were found in Kamloops. CTV's Mary Cranston is there, and Mary, this memorial was organized by a local artist in less than 24 hours.
Yeah, a powerful statement, Scott. 215 new pairs of shoes were purchased just for this memorial. When Tamara Bell, the local artist, first heard the news this morning, she said it brought back horrible memories of her mother, who had attended a residential school. She had grown up hearing horrific stories of children not returning home to their families after going to school. She says, as a local artist, she wanted to do something that visualized the 215 children to help educate the public.
I can't imagine a child that I love never coming home and not getting an answer. Every single mother, you don't have to be Native, you don't have to be anything, you just have to be a human being to understand that there's a huge legacy in Canada that is so painful, but this one was so hard because it's children.
And as mentioned, some of these children were as young as 3 years old. The organizer, the local artist, hopes other local artists will step forward to pay tribute, not just to these children, but to all children who have died in residential schools. At 7 o'clock tonight, 7 o'clock tonight at the Vancouver Art Gallery, there will be a vigil held here at 7 o'clock. Everyone is encouraged to come by, say a prayer, and light a candle. Scott.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Good evening. First Nations leaders are calling on Ottawa to search for more mass graves at other residential schools across the country.
The demand for accountability is growing louder, and as CTV's Allison Hurst reports, we're getting our first look inside the horror that was a former residential school.
This is a tour of the residential school in Kamloops.
Walking through the halls, Rose Miller shows APTN News the school she once attended.
This is the heebie-jeebie place, the evil place.
She, along with her two brothers, were forced from their homes in Kanim Lake and brought to Kamloops Residential School.
We were told if we didn't pray, we're going to go burn in hell, or the Romans are going to come and rape us and burn our eyes out and burn our hands and our feet and burn off our fingernails. So we pray all the harder.
The school was Canada's largest residential school. It closed in 1978. Last week, the Kamloops Secwepemc Band found the remains of 215 children on their grounds. An outpouring of grief has followed, with many bringing flowers, messages, and stuffed animals to the memorial, while Indigenous communities gather to honor their lost brothers and sisters. The Tsleil-Waututh First Nation held a drumming circle, filled with emotion as elders shared horrifying stories of their experiences at residential schools.
We need a national day of mourning so that our people can come together and do the things that we did today.
Chief Leah George Wilson also wants to see the government support and fund investigations at other residential schools.
Kamloops was able to do the work that they did because they had people that wrote grants or found funding to do that kind of work. It was not supported by any church or any level of government, and that, in my view, is wrong.
The Vancouver Archdiocese with this to say.
I would like to just tell you that that's not true, what you just said. The church has apologized in many ways, and I'll tell you how. There have been, first of all, Pope Benedict formally apologized. Pope Benedict the 16th in 2009.
It's not about fixing the past. It's about what can we do to fix the now and the future, and making sure that we live up to those expectations.
Moving forward, Wilson George wants to see more Indigenous voices in governing institutions.
There is no shortage in places where Indigenous voices have not been heard. Justice, child welfare, education, and health.
The final report from Kamloops is expected in the coming weeks. Allison Hurst, CTV News, Vancouver.
For survivors of residential schools, the Kamloops discovery isn't just a discovery. It's a reminder of trauma, of suffering, and injustice.
Now those events are coming to light once again, and the children of survivors are also speaking out about the impact. CTV's Alyssa Thibault has one woman's story here in Vancouver.
hunger was a big thing for her, and they went to bed without food many times. And, they were starving, basically.
Diana Day is speaking about her mother and the experience she had in a residential school in Ontario.
My mother and her mother went to the Mohawk Institute, and it was known by our people as the mush hole. They never spoke about it, their experience, much in residential school.
Day relocated to Vancouver in the early 80s. Her mother died in 2004.
Always, as an adult, eating before bedtime and making sure that her belly was full when she went to bed, because she never had that as a child.
An experience passed through generations. Day's great-grandfather also went to residential school.
I'm an intergenerational survivor. A lot of trauma.
Schools like the one in Kamloops may no longer operate in Canada, but the impacts are lasting.
I'm really concerned about the survivors that are out there that are hearing all of this and that are experiencing their trauma once again.
Day is the lead matriarch of the Pacific Association of First Nations Women in Vancouver. She wants to create a local healing centre and is working on education programs around racism.
That's the thing that I'm really interested in growing, is an army of champions against racism.
As the country comes to terms with the devastating news of what lies beneath the surface of this school, Day hopes it will be a time of healing and progress.
We need people all around lifting our people up, and I hope that Canadians will learn from this and that they will reach out to Indigenous people and to let them know that they've heard it and that they might not understand, but they want to learn.
Alyssa Thibault, CTV News, Vancouver.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us on this day of reckoning in this country as politicians and survivors come to terms with last week's discovery of the remains of 215 children on the grounds of a former residential school in Kamloops. Tonight, we're getting our first look inside those halls of horror while public memorials are growing across the country. CTV's Ben Milger is live at the Vancouver Art Gallery tonight, where a memorial to those children has become a place of public mourning. Ben.
Nafisa, as people stop by here to reflect, some sing, some cry, others stare in stoic silence at 215 pairs of shoes representing young lives cruelly taken and then buried for decades. Many Canadians have expressed shock at what happened, but survivors of residential schools say they've known about this for decades. The largest group of Musqueam band members to gather in more than a year sang, danced, and laid flowers to honor the lives of 215 innocent children whose remains were discovered on the grounds of an Indian residential school in Kamloops.
Doing this uplifts us and brings us back together.
In Kamloops, the memorial outside the school grows as many Canadians express shock at the discovery. But it comes as no surprise to the survivors who remember their siblings and friends disappearing.
This is where I attended from 49 to 52 and then came back in 56.
Rose Miller, one of those survivors, took APTN News on a tour of the school in Kamloops.
This is the heebie-jeebie place, the evil place, where the priest said the Mass. We were told if we didn't pray, we're going to go burn in hell.
For years, Indigenous elders have shared the horrors of what happened, but the stories rarely reach the ears of those outside their communities.
For Indigenous people, this story is not shocking, nor is it unimaginable. This is the trauma our families have carried for generations.
The Prime Minister acknowledging Canadians have much to learn.
These are the things that Canada is waking up to this week, and it's a difficult and hard awakening, but it is one that we need to take as a responsibility.
6 years ago, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Residential Schools put forth 94 recommendations, including 6 focused on deceased students. Many Indigenous leaders accused the federal government of being slow to act, only offering lip service to real reconciliation.
Trudeau can speak that, but now it's time to do action and start talking about it.
Nafisa, today the Prime Minister promised concrete action, but struggled to define exactly what that looks like for Indigenous communities across the country. If they had their say, it would include forensic investigations at every residential school site so that no child who was stolen from their family only to perish in residential schools will have to remain forgotten and can be honored. Nafisa?
All right, Ben, thank you.
The residential school tragedy has reopened deep wounds for Indigenous people across the country, and it has had a profound impact on a member of our CTV family, reporter Ben Milger.
Tonight, he shares his own personal journey, grappling with questions about his identity, his long search for his family, and sharing his own Indigenous heritage publicly for the very first time. He spoke with our Scott Hurst.
So the stories of Indigenous people are also my story.
Ben Milger has told thousands of stories during his journalism career, but never one like this.
I felt abandoned, but I dealt with it.
He's now sharing his own story for the first time, coast to coast.
I, Ben Milger, am an Indigenous man. And it's important for me to verbalize that because for my entire life, I have been disconnected from my heritage, my culture, and my family.
It was reporting on the Kamloops tragedy just a few nights ago that spurred him to speak up.
Some sing, some cry, others stare in stoic silence. It hasn't been an easy journey. I spent a lot of time in people's homes, listening to them talk about their vanished sisters, mothers, daughters. And at some point, I began to realize the similarities between their stories and my story.
Ben grew up mostly in foster care, hasn't known his mother since he was a toddler, and for a long time was left wondering, whatever happened to her? Was she a murdered or missing Indigenous woman? Then, as a young adult, he reconnected with some family members.
And each new person that came into my friend group, I would always ask them the same first question: do you know where my mom is?
Nobody knew, until just recently. Incredibly, he now has an answer. She's alive, living in a care facility in Toronto, but a serious medical issue has impacted her speech and memory.
I'm so grateful that she's alive and that I hopefully will have the opportunity to meet her.
And when that day comes, what he'd say to her.
That I wish she had been a part of my life growing up. And that I want her to be a part of my life going forward.
Ben, this is your community.
It is. This community has been like a family to me over the years.
Ben now calls Commercial Drive home, a place very special to his heart. A home that's provided stability, even given him strength to speak up.
It's absolutely a liberating moment in my life.
A new beginning for a friend, a colleague, a veteran journalist, and a proud Indigenous man. Scott Hurst, CTV News, Vancouver.
The heartbreaking story of the discovery of the remains of 215 children at a residential school in Kamloops has resonated with many people here in BC and across the country.
And it hit very close to home for CTV reporter Ben Milger, who became emotional during a recent live report on CTV News, and it led to him sharing something that he'd kept secret for most of his life, that he's an Indigenous man.
And Ben joins us now to talk more about his story that we saw earlier in the newscast.
Ben, first of all, thank you so much for sharing that story, for joining us to talk more about your journey. Obviously, that has been read tens of thousands of times on our website since you posted the story last night. What's been the reaction from people, not only here in Canada, but I assume from around the world?
It's been overwhelming. I've heard from people right across the country, in places that I used to work, former colleagues, former viewers, and also people who are part of my family on my mother's side, who I have not yet connected with, reaching out to let me know that I have their support and that they're eager to meet me and welcome me into their family. So it's been an incredible 24 hours, and I look forward to seeing where it goes from here.
Great that your family's reaching out. I'm sure they're very proud of you. So, Ben, when it comes to your Indigenous roots, How difficult was it to embrace that, and why choose now to tell your story?
There's never been any shame over my Indigenous heritage, but there's been embarrassment about my family situation. I grew up primarily in foster homes. My mother hasn't been a part of my life since I was a toddler, and I don't know all of the circumstances around that. And as conversations come up, right from childhood into adulthood, family stuff is small talk that people make all the time. And for me, it was always very difficult to join and participate in those conversations. And as a defense mechanism, I just didn't talk about my family. I didn't talk about my heritage. I avoided those types of conversations because it was easier for me. But now, given what we've learned from Kamloops and the emotional way that that impacted me, and the way that it's impacting people all across the country, I realize that we as a nation have an opportunity to have a more meaningful conversation than we maybe have on these topics and subjects in a long time, or if ever. And I feel that I can really contribute to that conversation, and that's why I've chosen now to be public with a story that until now has only been known to my very closest friends in my inner circle.
So now that you've taken this first step, and the most difficult step likely is just speaking openly and publicly about it, what do you want to do next? What comes next for you?
I'd like to meet my mother. She was missing for close to 20 years. She had a medical incident that impacted her speech and her memory, and she wound up living in an assisted care facility in Toronto, which is where she is now. She was located by members of her family eventually, although they did have difficulty reporting her missing initially, as many Indigenous families report having issues when it comes to interactions with police. So I would definitely like to do that post-pandemic. I don't know what that's going to be like, but I'm really looking forward to finding out. I would also like to engage more meaningfully with other members of my family, and I would like to visit my mother's home community of Alert Bay.
Well, that's great, and we just are so glad that you're sharing this story, and we wish you all the best on your journey, Ben.
Okay, thanks, guys.
With the horrific discovery of the likely graves of 215 children in Kamloops come a number of sensitive questions about what happens next. One of those is whether the remains buried near the former residential school can ever be identified and returned home. A warning viewers may find some of these details disturbing. CTV's David Molko now on the unfolding science in the search for answers.
Underlying the collective grief and sadness.
It was devastating. It was actually quite mind-boggling.
The science that revealed the horror of potentially 215 children buried in unmarked graves.
I can't say I was shocked or surprised.
Because anthropologist and archaeologist Keisha Supernuts has used similar sensitive techniques across the prairies.
We're here on behalf of Enoch Cree Nation,
including near residential schools.
Really what the ground penetrating radar sees is changes in the soil. So it's not like it's an X-ray, right?
Instead, the radio waves that bounce back show disturbances. Highlighted in red, what are likely grave shafts, possibly coffins.
You do not see the bones themselves.
Stitch the cross sections together and you end up with a map like this. The more color, the more likely something is buried below.
To confirm 100% for sure, there usually requires what we call ground truthing, which is digging of some kind.
It's not quick and it's not easy.
Megan Bassendale specializes in forensic identification and recovery. And from her experience in places like Bosnia, Lebanon, and Georgia, getting answers, she says, even if you want them, can take years.
The families and the community are a fundamental part of it. If they don't believe in the process, then it won't work.
Complicating an already difficult decision over whether to disturb the dead, that children from some 30 communities were forcibly sent to Kamloops over nearly a century.
They've been holding that grief, that trauma for decades.
Each First Nation, this Indigenous archaeologist points out, with its own leadership, rituals, ceremony, and tradition.
It's up to every community. This is their decision and their leadership needs to be central to this, and their wishes need to be honored.
Some communities are not going to want to do that. And I don't want them to think that they have to do that in order to prove that there's burials there.
And David joins us live from the memorial on the steps of the art gallery in Robson Square. David, so many people moved by the tribute there. Now, has there been any indication from First Nations on which direction they'd like to go?
Just that it is far too early, Mi-Jung, to even pose that question. Later this month, they're going to be expecting a report that will detail some of the scientific techniques, potentially the findings, in the words of the Kamloops Secwepemc chief there. Her name is Roseanne Casimir. If people want to offer their support, they can do one of two things: lend a kind ear or truly honor the children. Mi-Jung.
Thank you, David.
The discovery in Kamloops has forced a reckoning across Canada and sparked efforts to try to identify those children. CTV's David Mulco reports on how the legacy of that system, built around erasing identity, could make finding answers now incredibly difficult. And a warning tonight, some viewers may find these details disturbing.
My whole heart fell out and I sunk into the floor.
Harvey McLeod and his brothers and sisters survived the Kamloops residential school.
There was that little boy laying on the floor, realizing that the rumors, the secrets that were going around into the school were true.
And the chief of the Upper Nicola Band is now searching his memory to find answers about those who did not.
The truth should be shared.
At the BC Archives, Genevieve Weber is paging through files from hundreds of boxes, looking for clues from Kamloops that point to the children who never came home.
We do expect to have a better understanding of the conditions and what may have happened.
But so far, there's nothing here about deaths or burials. Experts say it wasn't until 1935 that the government required student deaths be recorded.
49% of those cases, the cause of death was never documented.
And archivist Raymond Frogner points out, while 51 names of those who died in Kamloops were previously identified by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the lack so far of written evidence about 215 more children lost speaks volumes.
It was a lack of concern. It was a lack of resources for shelter, nutrition, healthcare, and again, it's reflected in the record keeping.
The missionary oblates of Mary Immaculate, which operated nearly half of Canada's residential schools, including Kamloops, says it's now turning over whatever it has left.
We were wrong in not doing it sooner.
They deserve to have a name. They deserve to be remembered.
Though filmmaker Laurie Somerville, who produced a short film about the Dunbow School in Alberta, where flooding in 1996 exposed previously hidden human remains.
Coffins were sticking out of the wall, the bank of the river.
Knows from her own research, sometimes history, ledgers she found in a museum and which the order wasn't aware of, might be hiding in plain sight.
What ledgers are you talking about? We have the ledgers. And I said, no, you don't. You're missing 2 ledgers.
As soon as you entered the school for the first time, your identity was forcibly taken from you. The number they were given, their hair was often cut off or shaved off.
And historian Tricia Logan adds,
sadly, it wasn't surprising.
Any discovery in these files about the 215 or any other child from the 30-plus First Nations whose families were forced to attend will be extraordinarily sensitive.
New information is often traumatic and it's often difficult.
I'm with people that are still crying.
Leaving survivors of both a school and a system described as cultural genocide once again facing a cruel reality while hoping against hope.
Whether we bring them home physically, we're bringing them home spiritually. We're bringing their spirit home.
David Mulco, CTV News, Vancouver.